I'm Edward Warfield. I'm the publisher of Citybiz, and I'm honored today to interview Christopher Calhoun, who is the founder and CEO of Paracrine Cell Therapy. Welcome, Christopher.
Great, Edwin. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Can you provide an introduction to Paracrine Cell Therapy and what has been accomplished so far?
Yeah, so Paracrine's a biopharmaceutical company, and we're focused on treating some of the greatest unmet needs in healthcare. So things like heart failure, diabetic foot ulcers, which are one of the leading causes of disability and one of the leading hospitalization costs for diabetic patients, and then a rare disease called scleroderma, which affects the hands and the function of patients. So over the last 20 years or so, most of the heavy lifting on this technology has already been done. The preclinical work, the clinical work, a lot of the manufacturing, engineering of these complex devices, that's all behind us. So what that does is that enables us today to focus on the clinical development and really the late stage clinical development to get this to approval and to patients around the world who really need it.
And can you explain your business model and some of your products?
Yeah, so it's effectively a point of care cell therapy. So we're using a patient's own cells. So we're not taking cells from a donor or manufacturing them in a lab or engineering them in any way. So the way it works is a patient would come in and they've got whatever the underlying condition they want to treat, and they undergo a small liposuction procedure. This is about half a can of Coke work. Can be done in any kind of procedure room, doesn't require a big operating room or a long, extensive surgery. This is about a 10 to 15 minute procedure. And again, they take a very small amount of fat tissue. And that's then placed in a single-use consumable in our device, a cartridge, if you will. And they push a button, and in about an hour, this system breaks down the fat tissue and it frees up these stem cells and other regenerative cells that live in that fat tissue, that are in the business of healing and repair. And so it concentrates those cells and it formats them in a way that allows the doctor to put them right back into the patient, but where they're needed, so that they can then affect healing.
So these cells come from fat tissue. Why fat?
Yeah, so we think of fat really as a homeostasis organ for energy, but it's over the last maybe 10 or 15 years, we've learned that fat is a much more engaged and involved organ. It's the largest endocrine organ in the body. So it secretes up to 600 or more different types of hormones, proteins, cytokines, basically signals, if you will, or instructions for the body to do things or for certain actions to happen within the body. It's also the largest immune organ in the body. So it's rich with inflammatory cells and inflammatory mediating cells. So not only upregulating inflammation is needed, but also, which is important for healing, but also downregulating inflammation, which is important when inflammation gets a little bit out of control. So fat tissue turns out to be really one of the richest regenerative sources and one of maybe the most important sources for regulating a lot of these different regenerative and reparative aspects of healing in the body.
And so what are the mechanisms of action of Paracrine cell therapy?
Yeah, so let me first define the word paracrine. So paracrine is, or what relates to paracrine signaling, if you will, is the local communication between cells and tissues. So endocrine, which is probably a more familiar word, is when it's a communication that's more global. So, it's maybe when a signal is going from a local tissue to the brain or somewhere else in the body. So endocrine is more of a global communicating system, whereas paracrine is really that more local cell-to-cell signaling. And now that, there's the last 20 or 30 years of development of cell therapies and how cells are working, the understanding and the mechanisms in which cell therapy works has sort of evolved, or at least our understanding of how these things work has evolved, so that we now understand that the communication of these cells and the local communication is really what's the most important aspect of the mechanisms, if you will, behind cell therapy. Think of it as the language of healing. So when you have an injury, that local injury environment is signaling out to the body, hey, I'm not getting enough oxygen, I'm not getting enough blood supply, there's this inflammatory response that's happening. And these cells then respond back by these various cytokines and proteins and signals, if you will, which is really their language. That's the communication back to trigger certain actions, promote for new blood flow, reduce the amount of inflammation that's going on, and then ultimately for tissue to repair, so that you're getting this sort of multimodal, or think of it as maybe a biologic response. So unlike a drug, which is generally programmed to go in and do one thing, mostly universally and indiscriminately, and typically treating symptoms, these cells actually don't go in with an agenda. They're going in more with a toolbox. And then they're responding dynamically to that local environment and those local communications and signals, that language that's coming out of that local tissue that's sort of changes over time. So there's a cascade to healing. There's a sequence. And so these cells sort of dynamically interact with that local environment to improve the blood flow, to reduce the inflammation, and then ultimately to promote for healing and repair of that underlying tissue. So it's really a biologic response that has a more of a long-term effect, more of a one and done kind of thing where you don't have to get this treatment for the next 20 years. You can treat the patient, but you're changing the underlying pathophysiology. In other words, you're changing the underlying condition for improvement so that it changes the course of the disease. So you get healing and you get repair. So you don't have to come back again and do it over and over. You've changed the course of the disease.
And so how many times do patients need to be treated?
So in our history, thousands of patients have been treated with this technology. And over that experience, we've learned a couple of things. One, that it's safe because you're getting your own cells. They're not really manipulated. And two, that these cells are working in this sort of multimodal way and that it's effective in many different indications. Now, it's not a panacea. This isn't going to work for everything. But for diseases and conditions that have underlying issues with blood flow or ischemia, which is a low blood flow, inflammation, which is pretty common to most of these underlying conditions and diseases that we're targeting, and where there's some sort of a tissue injury or the tissue damage that needs repaired. And in nearly all of the things that we've treated over the last 20 years or so, it's been one procedure. So it's really a one and done. Now, there may be opportunities in the future where you might need to treat a patient a couple of times, because in the first treatment, you can think of it as if you're preparing a garden. So, when you're going to go out and plant seeds in the garden, you don't just sort of throw them in the soil. You prepare the soil and you get rid of the rocks and you kind of clean it up. You water it, put fertilizer, and then you put your seeds in. So in some ways, for patients with really significant underlying conditions where there's extreme blood flow issues and there's extreme inflammation and larger wounds, there might be a need to treat them twice. So the first therapy, if you will, kind of prepares the soil. It begins the process of reducing inflammation, providing more blood supply, beginning the repair process. And then if you come back in a second procedure, I believe that that's going to even further improve that healing, improve the blood flow, and reduce that inflammatory environment so that you can get better outcomes over time. But for the most part, almost everything we've treated in our clinical trials are really all focused on a single treatment, which again, it sort of changes that underlying pathophysiology. It's changing the course of the disease toward healing and repair so that you don't have to come back and do it again and over and over.
And so what are the clinical trials that Paracrine is focused on?
We're focused on three different major needs in healthcare. The first is for diabetic patients that have ulcers that develop typically in their feet, so-called diabetic foot ulcers. And these are wounds that typically don't heal, and they can be progressive and they get bigger over time. And they're sort of developing because of the underlying complications of diabetes, if you will. So there's an inflammatory element of this, there's a blood flow element of this, and then you've got this tissue that continues to break down over time. And it's one of the critical views into the diabetic patient, if you will, because patients tend to get them later in the development of their diabetes. So they're typically sicker patients. And it's kind of an example of, or maybe a view into the patient's overall health. And it's a sign oftentimes of advanced disease where you've got more complicated things going on. And so it's important to treat these patients because the diabetic foot ulcer patient has a lower 5-year mortality than just about anything else out there, any of the common cancers or common diseases, except for lung cancer. I think that's about 47% 5-year mortality, and diabetic foot ulcers are slightly under that. So it's important to be able to treat these patients and then heal those wounds so that they don't progress onto amputation, which then leads to a much higher rate of mortality. So, beyond the lifestyle and the quality of life and the ability of these patients to do things and for their own comfort, as well as for the cost of healthcare, which is quite expensive to treat these chronic conditions, this is an important condition for these diabetic patients. Our second trial is focused on a rare disease called scleroderma. So sclera, skin, and sclera means hard, and derma means skin. So literally hard skin. One of the most common complications from scleroderma is the hardening of the hands and the fingers. And so if you can imagine a patient that, wants to button their shirt in the morning or tie their shoes or play the piano or pretty much do most things that we take for granted, becomes very difficult, and it can be very painful. Now, while the etiology of scleroderma is different than these diabetic targets that we have, the underlying condition is very much the same. It's a lack of blood flow, it's inflammation, and oftentimes these patients will also get digital ulcers or ulcers on their fingers. So there's a wound healing element to this as well. And so these cells work in that same way of restoring the blood flow and reducing the inflammation that ultimately leads to healing, but it improves their quality of life. It improves their function, their ability to do these things that are quite common. And this is a follow-on to a trial that was previously run that showed that in the sickest form, or patients with diffuse scleroderma, this can have a significant improvement on their quality of life and on their ability to do these kinds of things. And then our third trial is for heart failure patients. So as you know, heart disease is the leading killer of people, leading killer of diabetics, leading killer of women, and has been for over 100 years. And one of the most common forms of this comes in heart failure. So patients that originally have a heart attack, ultimately the damage that's there from the heart attack will progress and end up in leading patients into this heart failure condition, which is a progressive disease. And again, it's underscored by the same mechanisms. It's a lack of blood flow. It's ischemia. So you've the lack of blood flow, ischemia. You've got inflammation. And then ultimately there's this amount of heart damage that's there that continues to get more significant over time, that leads to a decompensation and a loss of function in the heart. And we've done numerous trials in heart failure patients, and we've been able to show not only can we reduce the amount of damage to the muscle, but we improve the blood flow, reduce the inflammation that ultimately leads to a better quality of life for these patients. So these are really some of the most important global unmet needs in healthcare today that we're targeting. And then ultimately, it's a very scalable platform because we can target diseases that have these same underlying pathologies, which is a lot of different, if you think about it, there's a lot of different conditions that have these common underlying conditions. So it's a very scalable platform. But as a company, we're very focused on these initial three.
So is there any part of the Paracrine cell therapy story or your personal story that you want to share with our readers that you haven't covered?
Yeah, I think this is a journey, and it's a journey in developing a therapy that's novel. Our approach is very different than pretty much anybody else out there because we're not just taking a single cell and then we're trying to manipulate it to do a specific thing, but rather we're taking this population of cells from the body, from the patient themselves, and then just concentrating them and putting them back in. So, there's a lot of new technology that's doing gene editing and programming and really cool and sexy stuff. But that's pretty early on, and they've got a lot of work to do before this is able to help patients. What's maybe exciting about Paracrine is that we're at the other end of that curve. We've kind of already gone through most of that development cycle, a lot of the early clinical and all the basic stuff, so that we can really focus on getting this to patients who need it in a pretty quick way. So these trials that I've described are mostly what they call pivotal trials or approval trials. So we could have approval by FDA and be in the market within 3 years or so of initiating these late stage approval trials. So our vision is to get this to patients as quickly as we can. And so uniquely, we're able to focus just on that clinical element so that we can get this to patients who need it.
Well, Christopher, I want to thank you for sharing your vision. I rarely bring myself into these interviews, but all three cases from the diabetic, but also we have one of my colleagues in India whose mother died because of that. I have a good friend who's a Harvard Business School graduate who in his started a company 10 years ago and now has scleroderma. So and he's a pianist now. So he's facing challenges there. And myself, having had a aorta bypass, all three things that you're hoping to address are really important contributions to healthcare and the medical system. And please keep us apprised as you navigate through your clinical trials. And we wish you the best of luck moving forward.
Edwin, thank you for having me. Thank you for sharing your personal experience as well. And we look forward to updating you on our success. Thank you very much for having me.